meeting on the crossroads where the two forbidden subjects of politics and religion intersect. This is the Sophie Scholl Roundtable, where we discuss, where we talk about in depth things that do relate to being a citizen, as we're also Christians. That is, dual citizenship as a Christian in the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom in which we live politically. And our kingdom is America, which brings us to the topic of the day with James Hagberg here with me. And we're going to talk about what is an American? What does it mean to be an American? James, you want to launch into that?
Well, looking at what an American is, and this is a term that is, it's important to discuss what an American is, because in our last segment, when we discussed nationalism, to be a nationalist is to be loyal to your nation, your group, your people that which you are a part of. And it's important to understand, what is the group that you're a part of? How do you define yourself? And as an American, it's important to understand what is an American, because American is it's different from almost any other country that's ever been founded. Almost every other nation is founded on a nation of usually ethnic lineage. France, Germany, Sweden, China, Russia. All of them have this. These countries are built on this belief that we as a people are not only bound by a common culture, but also a common heritage. Now, there are subdivisions of this. This is important to also understand, especially for people there. An example is, let's talk about Great Britain for 1 second, because the British people would classify themselves as Britons, but there's also that subdivision of Scottish, Welsh, Englishmen. And this is true almost anywhere else. And it becomes a little more nuanced in certain regions. But almost anywhere you go, these places, they're not necessarily there's differences in culture. There's differences in lineage. But they've all been founded on this more overarching commonality between them. But in America, it's important, I think, to look back at the founding of America. Why does America exist? And the reason for the American Revolution, it was first because we, as colonists, as subjects of Britain, over time realized that we are not British. But it was more than that. It was more than this sense of a difference in American culture, and that was an aspect in the original revolution. But there was more to that. It was more than just the sense of we are a separate culture and a separate people. The principles of the revolution were different. It was not a struggle solely for the independence of a distinct culture or a distinct race. Because ours was a founding on a concept.
Right.
It was founded, our country was based, our nation was based on principles. Principles of individual responsibility. And entails with that individual liberty, freedom of expression and assembly, and the right to defend yourself. And that all men are equal sovereign beings. And that's not something you see in other places. Now, other places will also afford these rights. These rights, they believe in them. They believe in the rights of all men, but they're many times kind of seen in linked with that nation. And America was, from its inception, the reason we existed was because our founding fathers saw these principles as not equal to a race of culture or lineage, but superior. That these beliefs must be beholden to none. They are not secondary to a state. They're not secondary to a culture, and they're not secondary to an ethnic lineage. And when you talk about what is an American, because the term has changed, because from its inception, the original colonists were predominantly British and Northern Germans and French. There was a fairly small European there wasn't a large diversity of these cultures or these ethnic groups. And this is where, when we discussed white nationalism and the concept of where do you get a white nationalist, it is the idea that that was the founding principle of America. And that America, like other European nations, like other nations, was founded for specifically on the principles of that lineage and that culture. However, I believe when looking at the documents that founded America, the reason we existed, and the government, the framework that the founding fathers established and the way it was written was fairly clear about this idea that ours is not a country of blood. Ours is a country of an idea. And as time passed in this country, it's been difficult because because the idea that nations are built on a single culture and a single people has been about as old as the concept of a nation state. It was derived from the concept that countries or kingdoms were simply people under the authority of a single king who was ordained by God to rule them. But in America, it wasn't long until... I'm trying to think. Because, okay, here's what I'm trying to say. Is that America has always been open to immigration. We've always been open to other peoples. It's not always been easy. And of course, there's always been bigots. There's always been those who have wanted to stand against foreigners, people who are different simply because they're different. But I think it's important that when we talk about immigration, and when we're talking about immigration from 200 years ago, or whether we're talking about immigration today, immigration is almost universally a net positive for societies. Because when an individual wishes to leave their home, leave the place that they were born and raised in, and they want to come to your country, it means that you're doing something right. It means that you're doing something well, and they recognize that, and they want to participate in that. And which is why America has always attracted immigration from all over the world. And I think the important thing to understand about what is an American is, I think it's so important that we encourage this, that it's important. But the most important thing about immigration is to understand that people who are coming to America need to understand what it is that made America.
Yes, right.
And what are the principles? If people wish to come to America, I think it's marvelous. But it's important to understand not to bring what you left. And which is why I think America's always often been described as a cultural melting pot, which I believe is an amazing thing. But I think it's important that when other cultures are coming to America, when other people wish to come and bring aspects of their culture, it's almost important to have a filter. Because if you look at cultures around the world, people will come and they'll bring their traditions, their foods, their music, their beliefs, and many of these things are good. They're fine, and there's no reason that they can't come and intermingle and interact with other cultures, and that's what America has done throughout many years. But the pivotal point is that almost every single culture is going to have side effects. If you and American culture is no exception. European culture is obviously no exception. I'm not trying, and which is why I think is important in America to understand that ours is not a single culture, not a single traditional culture. America is not apple pie. It's not baseball. So, because those are good, but if you're going to come here, you can't bring ideals that are contrary to our founding principles.
Right.
It's principles. Right. It's the principle of individual liberty. It's the principle of individual expression and you as a sovereign being being able to make your own decisions.
Mm-hmm. And I really appreciate how you have emphasized America being an ideal, a concept, because the great English social critic, theologian G.K. Chesterton said America is the only country that's founded on a creed. That creed being articulated in the Declaration. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I think as you've been sharing, you've helped us to see that those principles, those ideals must be understood by those who come in our country. That those within the country now need to understand them as well, that we see these principles as something to attain, maintain, and guide the way in which we govern ourselves. Otherwise, we're just going to be a chaotic mess, as I feel like we're seeing in one respect at the border,
yes,
particularly southern border. Because I'm wondering if those people there think more about the freebies than they do, okay, I understand what America is about. It's like, I see what they have, I just want to get it. Rather than maybe what it was understood in immigration past, where they understood what the nation stood for and those concepts that were built in to the country itself.
I think when you want to talk about the crisis at the southern border, I don't think it's right to try to, because I believe most of the people, the majority of the people who are entering America from the southern border illegally are honest people coming from a corrupt system, a country that is barely a country, run by drug lords and a corrupt bureaucratic system. And all they have to do is look north. They can see the prosperity of America. They can see the opportunity. And many of them, I believe, are simply trying to act in the best interest of themselves and their families. Many of them, and it's not, I just don't think many of them necessarily understand that it's important to understand what made America and why we are this way. I think one of the problems is there is that aspect to that, and I think it's important that, because it only takes a few people, only a few evil individuals.
Yeah.
It's like, obviously, like, in most of these people are good people. They're honest, but The problem that we're seeing is that and this is why the filter is important for all cultures and all people, because I see no reason why we can't have different cultures coming together and living. But the second people try to bring an aspect of their culture, their belief, that stands against the principles of America, the principles that all individuals are free, that all men have value, that all human life has value. The second people start to bring the ideas that one group is superior to another, ideas that one belief must triumph over others, that's the danger to America. It's important, and when people start to bring beliefs that are contrary to the morality and the ethics that have driven America's prosperity.
Or ideologies. Do they want to bring their nation's, for lack of a better term, socialism to our country? The way in which things were done in Venezuela.
Yes. Well, I think that's another one of the great problems, is that when it comes to socialism, and socialism is one of the hardest things to discuss in my opinion, because to have a free society, to have a free country, we have to guarantee the right of individual liberty to think and to have an idea and have a belief, even if that belief is wrong. And I don't have a problem with anybody being a socialist. I don't have a problem with anybody believing in your own collectivized economy. I have a problem with people who want to bring a system in which that collectivization is done mandatory, when it is implemented by force. If you wanted to start a collectivized business or an economic zone, I'd love to see it happen. I'd love to see it try. My problem is whether it is an ideology, an economic system, a culture, or a religion, any belief whose purpose is fundamentally opposed to the principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Ideologies that are inherently against those core beliefs, and ideologies that are also detrimental to society. There are those. But I think the most important thing that we have to do as Americans to understand is that being an American is not being of a specific blood. It's not being of a certain lineage. It's like a contract. To be an American is to have a belief in these principles. These universal truths, and whether you believe that these are the laws, the natural laws endowed by our Creator, or these are the natural laws of nature, and that it doesn't matter. So long as you believe in them, and so long as you will stand for those beliefs, I believe anyone can be an American.
Well, I so appreciate about what you mentioned, the southern border, meaning how there are bad apples in the group, and don't want to project those few as indicative of the many we're trying to come on over, because I think you're correct that they would have a certain work ethic that would be consistent with individual responsibility. That's not to say just want the border to be loose and the border to be insecure, but the element of principles being understood. And unfortunately, from within our own country, those very principles are being undermined by, I feel, many in academia that don't see what we were given at our conception as being worthy of maintaining. And I think just as regular citizens, we've got to continue to discuss it at a level you've helped us to see right now. Those principles that transcend culture, blood, ethnic lineage, and to rally people to that point. Anything you'd like to add before we conclude our time here?
Yeah, there's one last thing I'd like to just kind of clarify. In the last segment, we spoke about nationalism and loyalty to your nation. And as a nation is, in its simple terms, a broad group of people. And I declared myself an American nationalist, and I stand by that. And I think now that we've discussed what makes an American, I think it's important to that is what I am a nationalist. I am a nationalist to the founding principles of this country. The founding principles of liberty and individual responsibility, as those are inextricably tied. And so it's that distinction that has to be made.
Yep.
When discussing nationalism or any of these topics.
Right, because as you've mentioned, some people here would say, I'm just concerned about my European heritage being maintained, and they don't see the ideals, principles, and concepts that have been brought to us through our founding documents. And that's not what we want to be associated with. We want to be, like James just said, an American nationalist. And we need not shrink back from that. James, thanks so much for being here on the Sophie Scholl Roundtable. See you next time.